All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NeuroTechX webinar. I am your host, Sydney Swain-Simon, and I'm one of the co-founders of NeuroTechX. I apologize for the background noise. Unfortunately, they're doing construction in my building right now, so I'm going to have myself muted for most of this conversation. It'll be Irina that will be talking for most of it anyways, but I'm just going to do a very quick introduction to who we are and what this webinar, in fact, is. So, if you have not heard of us, NeuroTechX is a organization, and we are an international community that facilitates the advancement of neurotechnology. We have a focus on open and accessible neurotechnology and our community has helped to innovate in the domain through a wide variety of different projects. We have contact points with 11,000 people worldwide and have collectively done over 150 events. Because we are such a large international network, the goal of these webinars is to give people from different countries and different disciplines the chance to learn about different neurotechnology subjects. We will be doing webinars on different themes such as VR and EEG, as well as showcase some of the amazing projects and research that our community does. As mentioned, this is an ongoing thing for us. This is our third one in total, and is still a work in progress. So if you have any feedback, please let me know. And with that in mind, we have a few things that you should know about for this webinar. Number one, just be respectful to those in chat. If you do decide to troll, you will get a timeout. And if you do have any questions, please post them in chat as well. So chat should be enabled. Hopefully it is. I'll take a quick look. Yep, so I'll just do a quick hello. So that is the major rules. The other thing that you should know is that if you are interested in doing your own webinar, there's two ways you can reach out to us. You can either email me at sydney@neurotechx.com, or you can email yannick@neurotechx.com, or you can also reach out to me on Slack. And my Slack username is just sydney_neurotechx. With that, let's jump into our webinar. So for this month, we have the webinar, BCI UX, Evaluating User-Focused Paradigms for the Purpose of Enhancing Brain-Computer Interaction. The webinar will cover two research studies on user-focused paradigms, step-by-step from paradigm design to lab experiments, and the analysis of the research outcomes based on advanced and complex signal processing and machine learning techniques. Towards the transfer of real-life applications, specifically the research focuses on improving the BCI interaction by designing the BCI paradigms according to user needs and desires, making it easier and much more natural for them to interact with future BCI systems. In particular, the often monotonous task of BCI systems are replaced with more engaging activities, and the context of used mental state detections is investigated instead of the strict activities requested by usual BCIs. As mental tasks, cognitive processes, and motor imagery tasks are investigated in these two scenarios. So to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Irina, Emilia, and Nicolae. Irina is a researcher of the neurotechnology group at the Technical University of Berlin. She is following a joint PhD at that university, as well as the Polytech University at Bucharest, in the field of signal processing and brain-computer interfaces. Her research focuses on cognitive processes and motor imagery, targeting user-focused paradigms and user state monitoring. And with that, I will ask Irina to take on over.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I hope you hear me already. Let me know if everything is working properly.
We hear you great. Go for it.
Great. Then I will start going through the presentation, and at the end, I will be more than happy to discuss with you about what the improvements could be done and how to transfer from research studies to real applications. And I will be even more happy to continue the discussions on Slack. I will share the screen now. Okay. Right. So first, I will sorry. Yeah, perfect. First, I will go to through the 2 research studies that I've implemented during my research so far, in which the first one relates to user-efficient motor imagery tests, and the second one considers cognitive processing levels that could be further used for mental state applications. Now, the idea came from the research problem, which relates that the majority of present and past research is focusing on methods to achieve best performance in a human-computer interaction system, but however, impose strict and tedious tasks which induce tiredness and monotony to the user side. Now, in order to improve this interaction and increase user interest in benefiting from a BCI system, the attention should be focused more on the user and searching for tasks related to user preferences, or by focusing on user decisions or on the current mental state in order to control the respective application. And this is the idea that started my research, which will lead to the establishment of an efficient interaction between human and machine. And on the long-term goal, the idea is to silently decode the brain information and automatically adapt the application accordingly. In this sense, it will be important not only how the information is perceived in the system, but also what is exactly perceived and how difficult the perceived items are and at which level of processing. And for this, in terms of methodologies, the investigation starts, of course, with a research study where the paradigms are specifically designed and adapted, in this case, to account for users' interest, such as to optimize the stimuli and tasks to be more interesting and natural for the user. And I will cover this in the 2 studies separately. And next, after the paradigm was developed, the in-lab experiments are performed, like primarily in-lab experiments and then further outside of the lab, where health participants or participants like with different stages of illness are taken into the experiments, and the brain signals are recorded and further investigated. And advanced signal processing and machine learning methods are applied in order to investigate the neural correlates. And I will go over through all these steps during the presentation, and we will see together how it helps detecting and discriminating the different neural characteristics of the brain. And most importantly, how to consider only the neural characteristics and to reject the noisy activity coming from other sources like muscles or like muscle activity, which is noisy, and we only need the specific brain signals. Okay, so first the study which I am referring to relates to user-efficient motor imagery tests. And if you want to hear more about this research, I can happily share you the list of publications so you can find more information. And now the idea is that in a standard motor imagery BCI, the tasks are really tedious for the user. And the idea is to select specific task which relates to the user interest. And in such a way, the user will be further interest in using the BCI application. As potential applications, it can range from control, like control different devices, or motor rehabilitation, or even BCI training, and many more. So the possibility is large here. Now for in terms of the experimental scenario, 3 motor imagery tests were investigating during the study. Button press, motor imagery button press, which is a classical type of motor imagery. Arm lifting, which requires a bit more activity than just button press. And another specific task which relates to user interest, in this case trigger pull, referring to a gaming hobby. The paradigm is with repetitive stimuli, and it considers 3 types of periods. The first one is relaxation, consisting of 2 seconds. Then the next stimuli appear, which refers to the attentional period, where the user focuses on the screen and prepares for the next task, for the actual task, which consists of 0.5 seconds. And then there is followed by 3 seconds of task. In this case, left or right motor imagery, which is triggered by 3 types of stimuli separately. These were investigated separately. Visual stimuli, as it can be showed here with the visual arrows, or the visual attentional cue. Visual auditory, where only the attentional cue was replaced by a beep. And then voice stimuli. So I can already see a question, like why the stimuli are necessary. The stimuli are necessary in order to trigger, in this case, the P300, in order to trigger the brain effects. So we can investigate this further, and based on this difference, we can control the application. Of course, but this I will discuss further, that in a real-life application, it will be very hard to visualize these repetitive stimuli over and over again, and then make the decision, like control the application. So this needs to be improved in real-life application. But when investigating and when trying to develop the machine learning process and all the pipeline that is required before the application, of course, it needs to go to a research process. So in terms of the experiment, primarily only 1 participant was recorded, and for hardware, the BioPack system was recorded using 2 channels out of 32 electrodes, like the main channels corresponded to motor imagery, C3 and C4 electrodes, and 1 additional electrode to record the muscle movements, to confirm the presence or absence of the finger movement. In this case, mainly to confirm the absence of the finger movement, the arm movement, or the trigger pull movement. In terms of software acquisition, I used Acknowledge and Superlab for implementing the repetitive stimuli, and of course, MATLAB and EEG for signal processing. Now, in terms of the analysis pipeline, many improvements can be done here, but what I decided to choose in the beginning relates to a preliminary, easy setup, I would say, after the data was preliminary pre-processed and with artifact removal and filtering between 1 and 49 hertz, I've used to combine also the temporal features and also the spectral features without any modifications, like only considering the amplitude between 300 milliseconds and 2 seconds, where the highest amplitude, where the amplitude is more discriminative, and integrating also with the power band in both mu and beta frequency bands, where the motor imagery appears. Usually, the brain responses are investigated mainly in the oscillatory activity, and this is why I've integrated also the amplitude, the temporal information, to give a better improvement and a better discrimination towards the classification. And both of the features are considered also from the spatial information, like considering the both channels, C3 and C4. Further, for classification, all these features are taken together and analyzed via regularized linear discriminant analysis with shrinkage of the covariance matrix and validated with within 5 folds cross-validation. So now considering already, we can have a look of the evolution of the amplitude modulations over time in the mu band, and which is corresponding here to arm lifting. And we can see already, like, the first peak relates to the visual processing of the stimuli, which is equal in both cases, left or right visual arrow. But then after on a later time, more than 500 milliseconds further, the modulations change in amplitude between the left movement and right movement, with stronger fluctuations for the left imagery movement as compared to a decreased amplitude for the right imagery movement. This relates to uncommon activities which give higher potential than regular activities. Here, left arm movement for the case of a right-handed subject. And this is why I selected this specific period for the features. So I extract this information. And further, we can have a look of the perturbations in the spectral domain, or like here via time frequency representations, where here's the case for the trigger pull task with response to voice stimuli. And considering the contralateral hemisphere, like the C3 electrode, we can see that the most significant perturbations, according to a significance bootstrap level, appears in the mu frequency band between 8 and 12 hertz in form of a desynchronization, like lower dBs, and from considering the interval from 500 milliseconds to 1.5 seconds, followed by a synchronization in the same band at the later interval. And the same process can also be observed in the higher bands, in the beta band, for example, from 18 and 25 hertz. And again, I've selected these features and integrated them into the classification. We can also see some discrimination in the early interval, or in the theta, for example, here, or higher in gamma, towards gamma, But these perturbations were not encountered for all processes for the other activity tasks, and therefore they were not included into the classification. And to see the discrimination, this is just the classification performance between left and right motor imagery. And we can already see very high accuracies, of course, significantly above chance level, which is like around 90% or 80%, the lowest being 78% for, surprisingly, for imagery button press. But this might have to do with the setup in the beginning. And also that an imagery button press, and also like the imagery trigger pool, which have similar classification performances here, relate to the same voice stimuli. And the other ones, like visual stimuli or visual sound, gives higher performances in this scenario. So it will be interesting to see further, to have the voice stimuli for all the tasks, because due to time constraints, I haven't integrated this so far. And it will be nice to see the differences in this case, to compare between all tasks. But still, this is very interesting to be investigated further, since the performance is already high. In terms of number of trials, there were only few trials, like 20 trials per class, because the idea was to reduce the huge amount of trials and repetitive tasks of the paradigms, so it won't exhaust the user further. So just to sum up, the user stated had prolonged attention during the experiment, and stated also increased interest in his evaluation, and also he had a very good performance. So, and further, the next in-depth study should, of course, consider more higher group of participants and even more channel or more varied user-defined activities. For example, to consider uncommon activities which are in the user's area of interest, but which are not pretty common to him or her, because uncommon activities tend to produce higher perturbations. So it will be interesting to have something within the user's area of interest, but also not so common, like not a daily activity, as in the case for a daily gaming hobby. So this was shortly the description of the first study. I'm looking forward for your questions at the end, and we can discuss further. And I will go over to the second approach, which relates to different levels of cognitive processing. And the idea is to have this in order to further decode the information based on different mental states. In terms of in more detail, actually, according to the level of processing, the application should automatically adapt to the user state and like reduce or increase the amount of information presented or the activities that are requested to be performed by the user, leading to efficiency and avoiding overwhelming the user. In this scenario, other important benefits relate, of course, to explicitly removing and replacing the keyboard or mouse with the automatic brain state detection. And secondly, adapting the interface according to user state and needs, and not to specific and strict tasks which are imposed by the BCI. As applications, I think I've already mentioned. Oh no, like application, you can think of different kind of application, like industrial settings or computer applications or any kind of future applications. Considering signal acquisition, now I've used brain products with 64 EEG channels and also one EOG channel for removing the ocular movements. And for the stimuli presentation, I've used processing.org, and the stimuli were designed using Inkscape, partially using Inkscape, and for signal processing, MATLAB and Python. So this setup is a bit more complex, but it needs to trigger more closely the brain fluctuation, which relates to different type of processing, and also that brings the fluctuation closer to natural fluctuations, not induced fluctuations by the paradigm, but a bit more closely related to natural fluctuations. In order to investigate this, this new context is considers three different of levels, namely no processing, shallow processing, and deep processing, triggered by three different types of targets. So the amount of cognitive processing will be modulated by task instructions with visual stimulus presentation, in which the user takes decisions in according to the corresponding type of cognitive process. So it's more like a game in terms considering a paradigm similar to an oddball paradigm, also with repetitive stimuli, but more like a game. And separately, three cognitive processes are investigated: memory, language, and visual imagination. And three types of categories: animals, fruits, and mobility are considered for the stimuli, and different colors. And the structure of the paradigm is similar. First, there are 500 milliseconds of fixation cross, then the stimuli of 1.25 seconds, and then the 750 milliseconds of relaxation period. And in total, this is repetitive, and in total it gives like 600 stimuli for all classes. To explain a bit more, I will run the experiment, which starts with a short question considering participants' mood, like the current state. How are you feeling? Good, okay, or bad? And then the first image will show the target color and target category. During the presentation, the participant has to distinguish the color first and then the category in reference to the target. So each time, a pair of images selected from the categories will be selected, where the participant has to differentiate between color, as I said, if the color match the target color, then category, and then perform, if both match, perform a cognitive process, namely memory, language, or visual imagination, which will be specified in the beginning. So I will let it run for a few seconds so you can see. So first is the target, memory, with color red, and the category was fruits. And then the sequence starts. And for each pair of images, the user had to distinguish the pair of images. If it matches the color, then they have to add +1, and it's considered a shallow target because it requires a mild processing. And if the color does not match the original target, then the target should be disregarded and is considered as a non-target. And the user doesn't have to do anything additional. And for the case when both color and categories match the original target, then the user has to perform additionally the cognitive process, like the memory, language, or visual imagination. And for memory, the participants have to evaluate if at least one of the current stimulus are presented in the last target pair, like the last pair of images which had similar category and similar color. And for memory, to discriminate between, for language, to decide whether the number of syllables of the left image is greater or equal than the number of syllables of the right image. And for visual imagination, they have to refer to the objects in reality and perform dimension comparisons. So all these tasks are relate to a question task, and they have to count accordingly to the answer. Like if the answer was yes, if the task was passed, they had to add something extra and provide the total number counted at the end of the run. The mental calculation is only imposed to keep the subject engaged during the experiment, to have it like game, and also to have a small measure of task performance, so we know how the user is close to the actual number. This was in a nutshell. I can explain you further afterwards if you need more details. And considering the pipeline, I've after preliminary filtering and also rejecting the ocular movements, the muscle movements, and loose electrodes, I've used a multimodal approach again, considering the spatial temporal features with the amplitude, considering 5 optimal intervals with highest discrimination. And also from the spectral features, I've used common spatial patterns after preliminary filtering with spatial spectral decomposition to reduce most of the unwanted perturbations. And these were selected both from the alpha and the beta band. And everything was selected again using all the channels. and given to the classification, which is again regularized LDA with tenfold cross-validation. Now looking over the results, investigating first the amplitude of the signals, we can see the first peak, which is again equal for all three cases, where blue is non-target, no processing, green is shallow target, shallow processing, where only was representative with color detection and coloring category detection of the images, and deep processing, where the actual cognitive process took place, like memory, language, or visual imagination. In this case, the graph relates to the visual imagination case and recorded from the CZ. We can see that the modulation change after 300 milliseconds, and there is an increase in amplitude with an increased level of processing. And this is observed also in the spatial activity, where we can also see a higher activity in the centroparietal area related to a more complex task. And this discrimination is taken further for classification. Now, as I said, the first peak relates to only the P300, like detecting, visually processing the stimuli. And for the second peak relates to the discrimination between the actual cognitive process. Further considering the activity in the power bands, we can have a look of both alpha and beta bands and the amplitude evolution of the ERDs, like the envelope of the signals. We can see again modulations, that the modulations change according to the level of processing, such as with a decrease amplitude for a higher level of processing. And also more desynchronization in the spatial activity.
Just a quick question here. What is an ERD?
ERD is an event-related desynchronization, which is a desynchronization in the amplitude in a specific band, which relates to which is triggered by an event. In this case, it's triggered by the cognitive process of the stimuli. So we can see that the modulations are equal at the point 0, where the stimuli appears, but then depending on the cognitive process, like the actual event, the amplitude modulations change. Yeah. So this investigation was to see the difference and again select these bands, which were given to the selection of the common spatial patterns. And in the end, there's the integration of the amplitude of the most discriminative bands, most discriminative periods in the amplitude, and concatenated with the common spatial patterns. Like 3 classes were selected, 3 components, 3 CSP components were selected for each class. And what CSP does, it's a further measure of discrimination, and it distinguishes the activity sources with the maximum variance between the two conditions. So it's only binary differentiation here, where the first CSP relates to the deep processing and shallow processing discrimination in the alpha band, and the second graphs also show the discrimination in the beta band. And here's only the discrimination, the sin square discrimination in the oscillatory activity. What is important to investigate within the spatial components, it's the intrusion of artifacts. Also to detect the neural activity alone, specifically to the sources, and which gives us more information of the corresponding activity. And we see more activity in more pronounced at the parietal location in the discriminability, and now which relates to neural correlates. And there are no like localized activity which would relate to artifacts. So after going to the investigation, and of course there are even more, the discussion could go longer. We can have a look of the performance of the classification. I have applied different methods, but for this case, the linear classification gave the highest performance, the LDA, and this is for the binary setup, like differentiated between two classes each time. And we can see the area under the curve. Accuracy considering memory, language, and visual imagery for all three cases for all three discriminations. And we can see the highest discrimination between no processing and deep processing, which also is, it relates perfectly to the highest discrimination in the graphs, like here. Was a higher discrimination between no processing and deep processing, and also the classification relates to this difference. Of course, it's more harder for the classifier to discriminate between shallow and deep processing. Of course, more improvements could be done, like switching to multi-classification approaches and other more adaptive techniques to improve the performance. But all of them are highly significant over chance level. Now to sum up, the stimuli turned out to be captivating for the participants, which were engaged the entire duration of the sessions, and also expressed a good mood during the entire duration of the experiment. And the discriminative patterns of cognitive processing showed highly discriminative information in both amplitude and also the spectral, which, considering this double integration, gave us high performance for the classification. And also the components seem to have no intrusion of artifacts, which is of interest to be considered further. Now just some ideas for bringing closer this gap after the finalization of the research studies and switching to transferring to real applications. There are various aspects which needs to be considered, and more implications and more complex aspects arise. First, the transfer from in-lab settings, where the user is restricted to few permissible movements and tasks, towards out-of-the-lab scenarios, where more dynamic movements are involved and more perturbations. Then, extra care is required when processing the signals. So artifact removal has to be optimized to account for the additional movements. Another aspect relates to the paradigms, which may be transferred from the repetitive stimuli presentation, considered here when investigating the ERPs or the sensory motor rhythms in case of motor imagery, to approaches which consider continuous aspects of the brain activity, like analyzing the continuous oscillatory aspects of brain activity, triggered, for example, by workload. And in this particular case, of course, the signal processing and the machine learning techniques need to be adapted exactly for the setup from the artifacts and filtering towards classification, feature selection and classification. And also the transfer from offline settings to continuous monitoring, which involves more adaptive processing techniques, and further the implementation towards mental state detection. And further, the natural fluctuations needs to be more closely investigated, like, for example, considering specific user decisions with more flexible scenarios. For example, where the case where user can willingly choose a task or not, which will provide further information on the internal mechanisms of user intentions. Special feedback needs to be provided to the user, such as and also the respective application should automatically adapt in real time according to the mental state. So, and in terms of hardware, for example, more portable systems could be used, or more wearable designs, or the electrodes, like using dry electrodes or water-based electrodes, which will drastically reduce the experiment preparation and also help with the setup. However, additional care will be necessary related to the signal quality, because they are more sensitive to artifacts. So there are more ideas and more modifications that needs to be performed, and I'm really curious what are your suggestions and your ideas to lower this gap between transferring from research to real life applications.
Well, thank you very much, Irina.
Thank you very much. So now, yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions and discussions.
Well, so yeah, for people in the chat, please post your questions. I have a few already that I can ask you right now. So there was one question actually where they just wanted to know what was the number of channels in the classification for the second study. Was it 64?
Yeah. So the second study considers 4 channels, but during the selection of the features, only the channels with highest discriminations are considered, and also the special filtering with SSD reduces the amount of channels towards, I think, somewhere between 15 and 32 channels.
Okay,
And
great.
this is additional after ICA in order to reduce more of the artifact components.
Great. Another question. In case of muscular activity recognition, would it be helpful to get signal from more electrodes than just C3, C4, or it will just create more noise?
For the motor imagery experiment?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes, I think it will really help. First, to considering the neighboring electrodes for C3 and C4. And also to have electrodes from few electrodes from the frontal and the occipital area to remove the ocular activity. Exactly. But otherwise, it should be fine. It should not add to 64 or more. Like 16 would be fine to cover all these areas.
And so I know there are a few people in the chat that are people that are working heavily with the BCIs right now. And for those that are interested in maybe learning a little bit more about how to optimize their protocols so that they're going to get the highest level of engagement, do you have any further publications or books that you would recommend to them that they should look at?
Yeah, of course, I can send them afterwards. There are a couple of.
Anything off the top of your head?
Right now, immediately, yeah, I don't know the names. I will have to check.
Okay, well, just send me the link and we'll put them in the description of the video.
We'll be happy to share.
Great. So AJ has a question in terms of the first experiment. What did you use? Where was your reference? And did you use a bias electrode?
Yes, and the reference was on the forehead.
Reference was on the forehead. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. And for the second one, the references were on the mastoids.
And so just a question on my side. One of the things that I'm trying to understand from the research that you presented is, were you able to essentially do a comparison of your paradigms? So you've listed, you've enhanced your paradigms in such a way that, you can get a much better response from the participants. But were you able to kind of compare to prior experiments and see how well it did compared to those? Was that one of the things that you were able to highlight? I didn't really notice.
To other experiments, you mean?
Yeah, prior experiments.
Yes, I've looked on the literature, but it's always this issue, and I've compared with some of the subjects, and with some of the other experiments, and I presented this in my publications. However, it's really hard because every experiment differs from another. So in order to make a proper comparison would mean to have similar setups and everything should be similar for a proper comparison. And also another fact is that the data is not available. So most publications don't provide also their data to be analyzed. So I can further compare. I can only relate with the results that they present in the manuscripts.
What was one of the more surprising findings that you found when you were doing these two studies?
For the second one, it was indeed to see this modulation in amplitude for the cognitive processing. This was really nice, and this is like a new investigation because this was not integrated so far, considering BCI applications, but rather this approach was only investigating in psychology. and
Sorry,
like these the levels of cognitive processing. Yes.
so I have a question from Maktar. How do you make sure the stimulus is well interesting to the participants?
Yes, I have the pilot study in the beginning with 5 participants, and I've modified the setup, like the duration of the stimulus and also the actual stimuli to be more interesting for them, and also this paradigm itself, so it will be more interesting, but still not to divide too much, so we could still trigger something.
So you said that you had a pilot study done at the beginning. How many iterations of that pilot study did you have to go through before you found something that was optimal?
I had 3 iterations, I think.
3 iterations?
3 small iterations.
Right.
Yeah.
So I got a question from Yannick. What's your opinions on data sharing? Have you shared previous data sets? What would you do to incentivize to share, or what would be the incentivize to share or to not share?
Yes, that's a nice approach. I'm actually trying to support sharing, because this is very important and would help us advance further. And for the first study, I've published the data, but I think it's still on like locally. So I need to provide to publish it to another online service, which can be accessed further. And the second data is already published too, so it's shared online. I have the link. I can share it with you afterwards.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So just a more general question. So we've got a little bit more time, about 1 more minute. So for people in the chat, if they want to ask their questions, please do so now. But one general question that I just wanted to ask you is, what do you think, in your opinion, is the hardest thing to get right when building a BCI?
From building the actual paradigm?
From a user experience context, yeah.
Yeah, so I think in the beginning, like developing the paradigm and setting, it really needs special attention, because you also need to consider the neural brain responses that you want to investigate further, but also you want to make sure not to make the user being more tired after the experiment. And yeah, also the duration of the experiments and everything which needs to be considered.
And final question, once again, from Maktar. Is the feedback paradigm enhancing the motor imagery SNR?
Yeah, so this is a very, very nice suggestion. Like, it will be nice to have, like, the feedback so far was only visualizing the signals into the power spectrum, and also into the amplitude. So no specific selection was considered for feedback. So it will be nice to have approaches, like to actually see the special activity on different bands during the motor imagery process, which would further enhance the feedback and also increase the signal to noise ratio.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Irina. I greatly appreciate you taking some time to put together this presentation and presenting it to us at the NeuroTechX community. For people that may have additional questions for Irina, she can be found on Slack. Her username is just Irina, Irina. Try not to bug her too much, but please be very polite and ask her questions if you have any additional ones. For our next webinar, it will be in about a month or so, and the theme will be on neuroethics, and it will be hosted with the International Neuroethics Society. So it sounds really exciting.